The sound of wedding bells echoes through the corridors of the Spanish Alcazar. But if you listen closely, you can hear something else. The quiet sobbing of a 14-year-old girl who never chose this fate. Picture this: Madrid, 1560. A grand ceremony unfolds with all the pageantry befitting a royal wedding. Nobles in silk and velvet fill the cathedral. Incense rises like prayers toward painted ceilings. At the altar stands King Philip II of Spain, 32 years old, pale and severe, waiting for his bride. She walks toward him now, draped in cloth of gold that weighs more than her frail frame can bear. Isabel de Valois, barely out of childhood, torn from everything she's ever known, delivered to this moment like a piece on a chessboard, moved by hands she'll never see. But here's what the chroniclers won't tell you. This isn't a love story. This isn't even a political triumph. This is the systematic destruction of a human soul, wrapped in ceremony and blessed by God Himself. If you're drawn to these hidden corners of history, the stories they tried to bury beneath marble monuments and golden lies, consider subscribing. I want to know where you're watching from, because these tales of forgotten voices deserve to echo across every corner of our world. The year is 1559, and Europe bleeds. Well, France and Spain have been locked in a death spiral for decades, armies clashing across Italian battlefields, treasuries emptying, common folks starving, while kings play their games of conquest. The Italian wars have consumed an entire generation. French gold flows like water into military campaigns that achieve nothing but corpses. Spanish silver from the New World disappears into the moor of perpetual conflict. The cost has become unbearable for both empires. But pride runs deeper than pragmatism in royal bloodlines. In the shadow of Saint-Germain in Lille, morning light filters through diamond-paned windows into chambers where a 13-year-old princess plays with ivory dolls. Isabel de Valois moves through her days in innocence, so complete it seems almost sacred. Her world consists of tapestried chambers where unicorns prance through gardens of silk thread, tutors who speak to her in gentle Latin, and ladies-in-waiting who giggle with her over embroidery patterns and the latest fashions from Italian courts. She has no idea she's about to become currency in the most expensive transaction of the 16th century. The girl who will become Spain's most tragic queen was born into the pinnacle of French court luxury. Her father, King Henry II, commands an empire that stretches from the English Channel to the Mediterranean. Her mother, Catherine de' Medici, brings Italian sophistication and Florentine banking wealth to the Union. Isabel grows up surrounded by art, music, poetry, and the kind of refined culture that makes the French court the envy of Europe. At 13, she speaks fluent Latin, can play the lute with skill that impresses court musicians, and embroiders with the precision of a master craftsman. Her tutors praise her quick mind and gentle disposition. The chaplain commends her piety. The dancing master marvels at her natural grace. In every measurement that matters to the people who love her, Isabel de Valois is perfect. But perfection in the algebra of royal diplomacy equals vulnerability. The Treaty of Cato Camres will end the Italian wars, but peace demands sacrifice more precious than gold. The negotiators, men who have never held a child or soothed nightmares, or watched innocence bloom in a young girl's eyes, calculate the price with cold precision, not territory, though some will change hands, not treasure, though ransoms will be paid. The price of peace will be paid in flesh. A child's flesh offered up on the altar of political expedience. When the news reaches her, Isabel doesn't understand at first. Marriage, the word floats through her consciousness like smoke, insubstantial and strange. She's 13. She still sleeps with her favorite doll tucked under her arm, still races through garden mazes with her younger siblings, still believes that grown-ups exist primarily to protect children from harm. Marriage to the King of Spain. She's heard whispers about Philip II in the shadowy corners, where servants gossip and ladies-in-waiting exchange. Intelligence from foreign courts. The Spanish king is 32 years old, more than twice her age. He's a widower whose first wife, Maria Manuela of Portugal, died in agony giving birth to their son. The ladies speak in hushed tones about his melancholy, his obsession with religious duty, his court where laughter dies in corridors built from black stone and perpetual shadow. They whisper other things too, darker rumors that make them cross themselves when they think no one is watching. Stories about his illnesses, fevers that come and go without warning, tales of his sexual appetites, needs that drove his first wife to despair long before childbirth claimed her life. Gossip about the Spanish Inquisition, which burns heretics in public squares, while Philip watches from royal balconies, his pale face expressionless as smoke rises toward heaven. Why me? She asks her father, King Henry II, her voice small and lost in the vast throne room, where their private conversation unfolds like a death sentence delivered with paternal tenderness. The answer comes wrapped in silk phrases about honor and duty, about the sacred obligations of royal blood, about the glory that comes from serving France in the highest possible capacity. But the truth is simpler and more brutal because she exists, because she's pure, because her hymen remains intact, and her womb still waits empty for the seed of empire. At 13, Isabel becomes a signature on parchment, a seal pressed into warm wax, a living promise that France and Spain will stop slaughtering each other's children, at least temporarily. Her father explains the necessity with words that sound reasonable in his deep voice, but Isabel hears only fragments: peace, alliance, sacred duty, the good of the realm. He speaks about the thousands of French soldiers who will live because she accepts this marriage, about the prosperity that will flow from Spanish friendship, about the honor that will reflect on their family name throughout history. What he doesn't say, what he cannot say, perhaps cannot even think, is that he's selling his daughter's childhood to purchase temporary stability, that he's trading her body for breathing room in a conflict that will inevitably resume when the next generation of kings seeks glory on battlefields watered with other people's blood. The transformation begins immediately, and it's more thorough than Isabel could possibly imagine. Gone are the bright gowns that matched her youthful energy, colors that made her laugh, fabrics that moved like music when she danced. In their place comes severe black silks, cut in the Spanish style, heavy with embroidery that speaks of wealth, but whispers of mourning. The very clothes begin remaking her identity, pressing her natural vivacity into shapes deemed appropriate for a Spanish queen. Gone are the games that connected her to childhood joy. No more racing through garden paths with her siblings. No more hide and seek in chambers where tapestries provide perfect hiding spots. No more afternoons spent reading romance stories that filled her head with dreams of love and adventure. Tutors arrived to teach her Spanish phrases, She'll need to survive in a foreign court, but the words feel like stones in her mouth. Each lesson drives another nail into the coffin of her French identity. Shame stresses measure her growing body with clinical precision, noting every curve that suggests approaching womanhood, every angle that will need reshaping to meet Spanish expectations. The fittings become exercises in objectification, transforming her from a living girl into a mannequin dressed for purposes she's only beginning to understand. Every protocol rehearsal chips away at her natural spontaneity, how to walk so that her gait suggests submission rather than confidence, how to speak so that her voice carries deference rather than opinion, how to arrange her face in expressions of pious contentment, even when her heart breaks with homesickness and terror. Every lesson, every correction, every perfectly executed curtsy is a chisel stroke, slowly carving away the girl to reveal the queen-shaped void beneath. But the cruelest lesson comes in a chamber hung with dark tapestries, lit by stuttering candles that throw dancing shadows on stone walls that seem to press inward like the walls of a tomb. Isabel, barely 14, stands trembling in her shift, while strange men with cold hands examine her like livestock brought to market. The verification of virginity performed not in merciful privacy, but before an audience of physicians, clerks, and Spanish ambassadors who watch with calculating eyes that see not a terrified child, but a political asset requiring authentication. This is no medical procedure designed for her welfare. This is theater of the most degrading kind, a performance where her most intimate self becomes public document, her body transformed into notarized proof of her value on the international marriage market. The chamber reeks of unwashed male bodies, parchment ink, and something else, the acrid smell of power, exercising itself without constraint or conscience. The Spanish ambassadors maintain expressions of professional detachment, but Isabel can feel their assessment like fingers crawling over her skin. They're calculating return on investment, measuring the French offering against Spanish expectations. The physicians approach their task with the brisk efficiency of men accustomed to reducing women to medical phenomena. They speak about her as if she cannot hear, discussing the shape of her pelvis, the development of her breasts, the tightness of membranes that will determine whether Spain considers the bargain acceptable. Their hands probe without gentleness, and their conclusions are recorded with the same dispassion they might bring to examining a broodmare. When it's over, when the documents are signed and sealed with wax that drips like blood, when the witnesses nod their satisfaction and file out to report success to their respective masters, Isabel sits alone in her chamber and weeps, not from physical pain, though that lingers like a burn, but from the sudden terrible understanding that she no longer belongs to herself. The girl who entered that chamber still harbored illusions about maintaining some private space in her interior life, some corner of her soul that would remain inviolate, regardless of what public role she was forced to play. The woman who emerged understood that even her most intimate physical reality had become subject to scrutiny and documentation by strangers. There would be no refuge, no sanctuary, no aspect of her existence that remained beyond the reach of political necessity. The journey to Spain stretches like a funeral march across the countryside, each day taking her further from everything that once defined home. The caravan moves with ceremonial slowness, as befits a diplomatic procession of such importance. French nobles escort her to the border with fanfare, designed to demonstrate their nation's honor and wealth. At every village, crowds gather to wave and cheer, but Isabel sees their celebration through a veil of numbness that muffles all sensation. They're cheering for peace, for an end to war, for the prosperity her sacrifice will bring. Children wave flowers, while their parents point and whisper about the young princess who will become queen of the greatest empire on earth. None of them see the girl dying inside the golden carriage, her face arranged in a smile that feels like a death mask. The French countryside passes by in a blur of green fields and stone villages, each mile marker counting down the distance to her doom. Isabel tries to memorize everything, the shape of clouds that seem different from the ones that will hang over the Spanish skies, the sound of French voices calling greetings in a language that will soon become foreign to her daily life, the smell of French earth that carries memories of childhood and its familiar embrace. At the border, at the river Bediso that separates France from Spain like a watery grave, comes the final severing. The ceremony is called the Exchange of the Princesses, a euphemism that sounds almost festive until you understand what it actually means. Isabel will be stripped of every connection to her past life and delivered naked of identity to her Spanish captives. French ladies in waiting, who have been her companions since childhood, must stop here. These women who know her preferences in food, who understand her fears, who remember when she was small enough to need help reaching high shelves, they cannot cross the bridge. Spanish women wait on the other side, strangers who will remake her in their own image. French clothes that carry the scent of home, the warmth of familiar chambers, the softness that cushioned her through childhood, these must be stripped away. The silk and linen that touched her skin in happier times cannot contaminate Spanish purity. Even her undergarments, intimate things that no one but her closest attendants have seen, must be abandoned like shed skin. French jewels that connect her to family history disappear into boxes that will return to Paris without her. The simple ring her mother gave her on her 12th birthday, inscribed with words of love in French, confiscated. The locket containing her father's portrait removed. Even the small wooden cross blessed by the French chaplain who baptized her, replaced with Spanish religious artifacts blessed by priests she's never met. She crosses the bridge, naked of everything that made her who she was, clothed only in Spanish silk that scratches against skin that remembers softer textures. The water flows beneath her feet like a boundary between life and death, between the person she was and the function she must become. With each step on the wooden planks, another piece of Isabel de Valois disappears into the current. The Spanish delegation receives her with ceremony cold as winter stone. They perform the required courtesies with mechanical precision, but Isabel can feel their assessment in every glance. She is a foreign import, useful only insofar as she serves Spanish purposes. Their smiles carry the warmth of diplomatic necessity rather than human welcome. The journey through Spain reveals a landscape as different from her homeland as Mars might be from Earth. The French countryside rolls in gentle green waves, punctuated by forests and streams that sparkle in sunlight. Spanish terrain stretches harsh and brown under a sun that beats down like divine judgment. The very earth seems hostile to growth, to joy, to the kind of natural beauty that once filled Isabel's world with wonder. Villages appear less frequently, and when they do, The people who gather to watch the royal procession seem carved from the same hard stone as their buildings. They stare at her with curiosity, tinged by suspicion. She is the French queen, forever foreign, potentially dangerous, certainly different from anything they've known. Their eyes follow her carriage with the intensity of people examining an exotic animal brought for their entertainment. The Spanish nobles who escort her maintain conversation in voices that sound like grinding metal compared to the musical cadences of French court language. They discuss her as if she cannot understand, debating whether she appears strong enough for frequent childbearing, whether her French blood might taint future heirs, whether her obvious terror suggests weakness or appropriate feminine submission. Each night, Isabel sleeps in castles and palaces that feel like fortresses rather than homes. The rooms are grand but cold, furnished with dark wood and religious imagery that seems to watch her from every wall. Spanish ladies assigned to attend her maintain polite distance, speaking to her in carefully measured phrases that emphasize their authority over her domestic arrangements. She is a guest who cannot leave, a prisoner treated with elaborate courtesy. The Alcazar of Madrid rises before her like a fortress designed by architects who believed beauty was synonymous with intimidation. This will be home now, this maze of corridors where whispers die in dark corners, where every footstep echoes like judgment, where windows admit more shadow than light. The building seems constructed from the fossilized remains of joy, massive and permanent, and utterly without warmth. Philip VI waits for her in the throne room, and Isabel's first sight of her husband to be steals what little breath she has left. 32 to her 14, gaunt where she is, soft black clad, where she still dreams of color. His eyes hold no warmth, no curiosity about the girl who's traveled so far to share his bed and bear his children. He sees her the way a craftsman might examine a tool sent from another workshop, evaluating function, not form. The king's physical presence dominates the vast chamber in ways that have nothing to do with height or build. Philipethy projects authority like heat radiates from flame, but it's a cold authority that seems to draw warmth from everything around it. Courtiers arrange themselves at calculated distances, close enough to demonstrate loyalty, far enough to avoid accidental intimacy. Even the air seems thinner in his proximity. When he speaks to her, his voice carries the flat tone of someone reading from a prepared text. He welcomes her to Spain in phrases that sound rehearsed, expressing satisfaction with the alliance her presence represents. He does not ask about her journey, her family, her feelings about the dramatic changes in her circumstances. These things do not register as relevant to their future relationship. Isabel responds with the Spanish phrases she's been taught, her accent marking her as foreign with every syllable. The words feel like gravel in her throat, harsh and uncomfortable, compared to the flowing music of her native French. Philip nods approval of her linguistic progress, but shows no interest in the girl struggling to master communication in a tongue that will never feel natural. The Spanish court gathers to witness this first formal meeting between king and future queen, and Isabel can feel their assessment like weight pressing down on her shoulders. They see her youth as either promising or concerning, depending on their individual calculations. Some whisper that she appears too delicate for the demands of royal motherhood. Others note with satisfaction that her obvious innocence guarantees she comes to the marriage uncontaminated by foreign influences. No one asks what she thinks, what she wants, what she fears. These considerations have no place in the careful choreography of dynastic alliance. Isabel exists to fulfill a function, and her personal responses to that function matter only insofar as they might interfere with successful performance. The wedding ceremony unfolds with all the majesty the Spanish court can muster. But for Isabel, it feels like watching her own funeral. The cathedral fills with nobles whose names she doesn't know, whose faces blur together in a sea of calculating stares. The bishop, who will perform the ceremony, speaks to her in Latin. She understands, but Spanish accented Latin. That sounds different from the gentle pronunciation she learned from French tutors. She wears a gown so heavy with gold thread and precious stones that she can barely stand upright. The fabric restricts her breathing and movement, transforming her into a living icon rather than a human being. Every step toward the altar requires conscious effort. The train trailing behind her seems designed to drag her backward, as if the dress itself understands that she's walking toward her own destruction. Philip waits at the altar with the same expression he might wear while reviewing tax ledgers, dutiful attention focused on the business at hand. He does not smile when she approaches, does not offer any gesture of reassurance or welcome. The ceremony is a contract signing, and both parties must simply fulfill their roles with appropriate dignity. She speaks the vows in carefully rehearsed Spanish, each word small death of her French identity. I, Isabel, take you, Philip. The phrases commit her to love, honor, and obey a man who regards her as useful equipment rather than a partner in any meaningful sense. The promises bind her to a life of service to someone who will never see her as deserving service in return. When the bishop pronounces them married, the cathedral erupts in celebration that sounds hollow to Isabel's ears. The nobles applaud, the choir sings, the bells ring out across Madrid to announce the successful completion of a diplomatic masterpiece. But Isabel hears only the clanking of invisible chains locking into place around her wrists, her throat, her heart. That night, in the marriage bed, whatever remained of childhood dies a violent death. The royal bedchamber has been prepared with ceremonial attention to detail. Silk hangings embroidered with Spanish and French heraldic devices suggest unity that exists nowhere but in political imagination. Candles cast flickering light over religious paintings that seem to watch the proceedings with painted eyes that hold no compassion for human suffering. Philip approaches the consummation of their marriage with the same grim duty he brings to governing his empire. This is an obligation that must be fulfilled to legitimize their union and establish her legal position as his wife. There is no tenderness, no recognition that the body beneath his contains a human soul deserving of consideration. He performs the act with mechanical efficiency, while Isabel stares at painted saints on the ceiling and tries to separate her consciousness from what is happening to her flesh. The pain is immediate and overwhelming, but worse than the physical violation is the emotional understanding that this is only the beginning. Her body now belongs to Philip as completely as any other Spanish possession. Her reproductive capacity has become a resource to be managed for maximum yield. Her most intimate experiences will be subjected to scrutiny by court physicians, ladies-in-waiting, and anyone else whose duties require knowledge of her fertility cycles. When it's finished, Philip withdraws without a word of comfort or acknowledgement of what the experience might have meant for her. He dresses and departs as if concluding any other royal obligation, leaving Isabel alone with blood on the sheets and a pain between her legs that will serve as permanent reminder of her new status. In the morning, those blood-stained sheets are displayed publicly to confirm the transaction's completion. Isabel's most private moment becomes public proof. Her pain transformed into political triumph. Court officials examine the evidence and declare themselves satisfied that the French princess came to marriage with her virginity intact. The Spanish court celebrates, while Isabel lies hollow-eyed in bed, understanding finally and completely that she is no longer a person in any sense that matters. She has become a function, a service provider, a biological system designed to manufacture Spanish heirs. Every aspect of her existence will be evaluated according to how successfully she performs this role. Her health matters only insofar as it affects her fertility. Her happiness is relevant only if unhappiness might interfere with conception. Her thoughts, dreams, and desires have been reclassified as irrelevant noise, generated by equipment that exists solely to serve purposes defined by others. The years that follow blur together in a haze of duty and despair, punctuated by moments of terror, so profound they seem to stop time itself. Isabel learns the elaborate dance of Spanish court protocol, when to speak rarely, when to remain silent, always when her opinion differs from the approved position, how to arrange her face in expressions of pious contentment, even as her spirit withers like a plant kept in permanent shadow. She becomes fluent in Spanish, but her native French becomes a secret language she speaks only to herself in the dark hours before dawn, when sleep refuses to come and memories of home feel like visitations from the dead. Sometimes she catches herself thinking in Spanish and feels another piece of her original identity crumble away. The language of her childhood transforms into something private and precious, hoarded like contraband in a prison, where even thoughts are subject to inspection. Philip remains a stranger, sharing her bed, visiting her chambers when duty demands an heir, but bringing to these encounters the same mechanical devotion he shows when hearing Mass or reviewing reports from colonial administrators. He never asks about her comfort, her pleasure, her emotional state. Sex becomes a ritual of possession and submission that leaves Isabel feeling more isolated after intimacy than before. She searches his face during these encounters for some flicker of humanity, some recognition that she exists beyond her biological function, but finds only the cold assessment of a man cataloging his possessions. Philip's eyes hold depths of calculation, but no warmth, no curiosity about the person whose body he inhabits. With such regularity and so little genuine interest, the Spanish court watches her with predatory attention, measuring every gesture for signs of successful adaptation to their expectations. If she smiles too broadly, she's criticized for unseemly frivolity. If she remains appropriately serious, she's suspected of harboring dangerous foreign attitudes. There is no correct way to exist in their eyes. She can only succeed or fail at the single function they've assigned her. The pregnancies begin within months of her marriage, and with them comes a new kind of suffering that makes her previous trials seem almost gentle by comparison. Isabel's body, still developing, struggles to carry children conceived in encounters that leave her feeling violated rather than loved. Her first pregnancy ends in miscarriage, that is noted in court records as a disappointment, a failure of the queen to fulfill her primary obligation. No one asks about her grief when she loses that first child. No one acknowledges the physical pain of miscarriage, the emotional devastation of hoping for something, anything that might bring meaning to her existence, only to have that hope literally bleed away in the privacy of her chambers. Court physicians examine the expelled tissue with clinical interest, debating what might have gone wrong, how the process might be improved for next time. Each lost child becomes a statistic in ledgers maintained by men whose concern extends only to their professional reputations. Isabel Griavis, alone without the comfort of women who might understand her loss, without the consolation of religious advisers who see her suffering as anything more than obstacle to dynastic continuation. Her tears are irrelevant noise that interferes with the serious business of heir production. Picture her in the vast royal apartments, 14, 15, 16 years old, bleeding and alone, while physicians debate her fertility in whispers they think she cannot hear. The Spanish court watches her belly the way farmers watch weather, measuring, calculating, hoping for favorable conditions that will yield the harvest they require. Her monthly courses become matters of state discussion, conducted in corridors outside her presence, but within her hearing. Servants whisper about the timing of her fertility. Ladies in waiting maintain charts, tracking her cycle with scientific precision. Her morning sickness generates excited speculation about whether this pregnancy might finally produce the male heir Philip desperately needs. Her food preferences are analyzed for clues about the sex of developing children. Her dreams are interpreted as prophetic visions. Every aspect of her physical and emotional life becomes subject to scrutiny by people whose investment in her reproductive success far exceeds their concern for her well-being. The miscarriages continue with devastating regularity, each one prompting searches for blame that never center on the obvious cause that she's too young, too traumatized, too systemically undermined to successfully carry pregnancies to term. Court physicians prescribe bloodletting, herbal remedies, dietary modifications, spiritual interventions. They blame her French blood, her melancholic disposition, her insufficient piety. They never consider that the problem might be systemic rather than personal. Never enough consideration for the fact that she's still barely more than a child herself, forced to bear the weight of dynastic expectations on shoulders too narrow and a spirit too fragile for such crushing responsibility. The medical men who examine her speak about her reproductive organs as if they exist independent of the terrified girl who houses them. They see equipment that requires maintenance rather than a human being deserving of compassion. Between pregnancies, Isabel finds small refuges that keep her from complete despair. Music lessons provide hours where she can lose herself in melodies that remind her of home, where her fingers on lute strings can speak emotions her voice is not allowed to express. The Spanish musicians assigned to work with her maintain professional distance, but music itself transcends the barriers that isolate her from human connection. Hours in the palace chapel offer another form of escape, though even prayer becomes complicated in a place where religious observance serves political as much as spiritual purposes. She can pray in French to a God who might still remember the girl she used to be, whispering words her Spanish attendants cannot understand or report to their superiors. These private conversations with divinity become her only truly confidential communications. The chapel itself intimidates with its austere magnificence, Spanish religious art favors suffering saints and martyred virgins, images that seem to comment directly on Isabel's situation. She kneels before paintings of Saint Catherine, beheaded for her faith, and wonders if martyrdom might offer more dignity than her current existence. The Christ figure on the crucifix above the altar bears an expression of agony that mirrors her internal state more accurately than the serene Madonnas favored in French churches. Stolen moments with ladies in waiting who speak kindly provide fragments of human warmth, though always carefully, always aware that every word might be reported to the king or his advisors. These conversations never venture into dangerous territory. Criticism of the court, expressions of homesickness, admissions of unhappiness, but even discussions of weather or embroidery patterns offer connection to people who see her as more than biological equipment. But these comforts are shadows compared to the vast loneliness that defines her days and nights. Philip acknowledges her in public with formal courtesy that emphasizes their official relationship while denying any personal connection. He speaks to her as he might address any subordinate whose work requires his attention politely, clearly without warmth or genuine interest. Their private conversations, when they occur, focus exclusively on matters of state, religious observance, or the production of heirs. Philip discusses her pregnancies the way he might review reports from colonial governors. Interested in outcomes, indifferent to processes, Isabel might as well be addressing a portrait for all the human response her words generate. She learns to read his moods in the micro-expressions that cross his gaunt features. When he appears more distant than usual, she knows to remain especially quiet. When his jaw tightens in that particular way, she understands that something in the governance of his empire has frustrated him, and she will bear the emotional cost of his displeasure. When he looks through her, as if she doesn't exist, she knows he's calculating whether her reproductive failures justify seeking annulment and trying again with fresh genetic material. The Spanish nobility treat her with elaborate respect that barely conceals their assessment of her usefulness. She is the French queen, forever foreign, valued only for her ability to secure the dynasty through successful childbearing. When she speaks in council meetings, the few times she's permitted to speak, they listen with polite attention that vanishes the moment she finishes. Her words carry no weight beyond their entertainment value. When she doesn't speak, they interpret her silence as proof of proper feminine submission or evidence of intellectual limitation, depending on their personal prejudices. There is no correct way to exist in their eyes. She can only succeed or fail at the single function they recognize as legitimate for someone in her position. Years pass with mechanical regularity, marked by failed pregnancies, religious festivals that feel like endurance tests, and diplomatic ceremonies where she serves as living symbol of French-Spanish alliance. Isabel's reflection in mirrors becomes that of a stranger wearing her face. The soft curves of girlhood have been replaced by the sharp angles of chronic stress and premature aging. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity about the world beyond palace walls, now holds the flat resignation of someone who has learned not to hope for anything beyond basic survival. The elaborate court dress transforms her into a living icon, beautiful in the abstract way of religious statuary, untouchable in the same manner, and fundamentally hollow beneath the ornate surface. She begins to understand that her life will be measured not in joys or achievements or moments of genuine connection with other human beings, but exclusively in successful births. Every day that passes without securing the dynasty is a day she fails at the only task anyone considers important. The pressure is so constant, so complete, that she sometimes forgets there was ever a time when her worth wasn't tied exclusively to the contents of her womb. A 17, Isabel carries another child, and the entire Spanish court holds its collective breath. This pregnancy progresses further than the others, and hope becomes more dangerous than despair. Court physicians monitor her, constantly tracking every symptom, every change in appetite, every shift in energy level. Ladies in waiting hover with nervous attention that makes prophecy impossible. Religious advisors pray publicly for the health of mother and child, but Isabel knows they're praying primarily for the child, specifically for a male child who will justify the years of disappointment that have defined her reproductive career. Her body, finally mature enough to sustain life, nurtures the growing heir with determination born of desperation. She can feel the child moving within her, and for the first time since leaving France, she experiences something approaching maternal joy. This baby represents possibility, not for love, which she's learned is beyond her reach in this marriage, but for purpose that might give meaning to her suffering. Philip visits her chambers more frequently now, ostensibly to check on her welfare, but actually to assess the progress of his potential heir. He brings to these interactions the same careful attention he gives to important state documents, interested in outcomes, focused on successful completion, utterly indifferent to the human experience of the woman carrying his child. Isabel becomes a vessel under observation rather than a person deserving consideration. For the first time since arriving in Spain, she dares to hope, not for happiness, she's learned that lesson too thoroughly, but for the kind of peace that might come from finally succeeding at the only test that matters in this cold palace. If she can give Philip the son he demands, perhaps the relentless pressure will ease. Perhaps she'll earn some measure of respect. Perhaps she'll finally justify the destruction of her childhood and the sacrifice of her dreams. But even successful pregnancy comes wrapped in new forms of suffering that Isabel hasn't anticipated. The child grows, and with it grows her understanding that she's carrying not simply a baby, but the future of an empire. Every kick serves as a reminder of the stakes involved. Every hour of nausea reinforces her role as incubator for Spanish dynastic ambitions. The weight of expectation presses down on her already fragile frame more heavily than the physical weight of the developing child. She can feel the court's hopes and fears growing heavier with each passing month. Success in this pregnancy won't just vindicate her reproductive capacity, it will determine whether she remains queen or becomes an obstacle to be removed through annulment and replacement with more fertile imported breeding stock. Court physicians debate her diet with the intensity of military strategists planning crucial campaigns. They prescribe exercises designed to ensure proper positioning of the child during birth. They monitor her emotional state for signs of melancholy that might interfere with healthy development. Isabel becomes a walking medical experiment, every aspect of her existence calibrated to maximize the chances of producing a living heir. The Spanish nobility watch her growing belly with predatory interest that makes her feel like livestock approaching slaughter. They discuss her condition in her presence as if she cannot understand their rapidly spoken Spanish, debating whether she appears strong enough for the ordeal ahead, whether the child seems properly positioned, whether her obvious anxiety might somehow damage the precious cargo she carries. Labor, when it comes, is agony that no one prepared her for. Hours of pain in a chamber filled with strangers, physicians, midwives, court officials, waiting to verify the gender and legitimacy of the heir she spent nearly a year producing. The Spanish court requires witnesses to royal births to prevent any possibility of substituting healthy infants for sickly ones, or male children for unwanted females. Isabel screams in French during the worst contractions, the language of her childhood, returning in moments of extremity when conscious control dissolves under waves of pain more intense than anything in her previous experience. But no one in the birth chamber understands the words pouring from her lips, and no one particularly cares about her suffering, except as it might interfere with successful delivery. She begs for her mother, in phrases that mean nothing to Spanish ears. She cries for comfort that no one present knows how to provide. She pleads with God in French prayers that sound like gibberish to the Spanish physicians who view her labor as a medical event rather than human crisis, requiring compassion and support. The birth chamber fills with smoke from incense burned to sanctify the proceedings and purify the air for the emerging heir. Religious relics line tables around the room. Holy bones and preserved saint fragments intended to ensure divine protection for mother and child. But the spiritual trappings cannot mask the fundamentally clinical nature of the event. Isabel, giving birth under the observation of people whose concern extends only to the successful extraction of living Spanish royalty from her French body. When the child finally arrives after 18 hours of labor that leaves Isabel delirious with exhaustion and blood loss, it's a daughter. The disappointment in the room is immediate and palpable. A girl useful for future marriage alliances, but not the male heir Philip desperately needs. Isabel holds her daughter for mere moments before the infant is taken for examination, her value already being calculated by men who see babies as political assets rather than human miracles. More pregnancies follow, each one taking something irreplaceable from Isabel's weakening body. More daughters, more disappointments, more nights spent bleeding in chambers where her pain is recorded as medical data rather than human suffering. By 1568, at 22 years old, Isabel has the physical constitution of a woman twice her age. Chronic illness, repeated pregnancies, and the relentless pressure of court life have carved deep lines around eyes that once sparkled with youthful curiosity. She moves through palace corridors like a ghost haunting her own life. Her final pregnancy begins in 1568, and Isabel knows, with the certainty that comes from a body pushed beyond all limits, that she will not survive. The labor is brutal, lasting nearly 2 days, while physicians debate procedures and court officials send urgent messages to Philip. When another daughter, Catherine Michelle, finally arrives, Isabel manages to whisper a few words of love before hemorrhaging begins that no amount of medical intervention can stop. As fever consumes her and consciousness fades, Isabel drifts between the Spanish palace where she's dying and memories of French gardens where a 13-year-old girl once played with ivory dolls. In her final moments, she speaks not to the Spanish courtiers surrounding her deathbed, but to the mother she lost years before leaving France. Her last words, whispered in the French that had become her secret language of resistance are heartbreakingly simple. Justify I am tired. On October 3rd, 1568, Isabel de Valois dies at 22, 8 years after arriving in Spain as a terrified teenager. She is buried with royal honors, but the tears shed are diplomatic rather than genuine. Philip begins planning his next marriage alliance before her body is cold. History remembers her as a footnote, the French queen who failed to provide male heirs, but we should remember her as something else entirely, a child sacrificed on the altar of political necessity, whose short life illuminates the human cost of treating people as instruments rather than souls worthy of love. The tragedy of Isabel de Valois is not just that she died young, but that she was never allowed to live at all.